like to welcome all three of you. I think you're aware that I've lost my voice and will manage accordingly. And I think Mr. Spencer wishes to come in very briefly. I'll hand over to Mr. Aldous.
Could I just declare that I am a member of the CLA chair, just for the benefit of the committee?
I think I should do the same.
Mr. Aldous.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The government have come out with the objective of their aim is, and I'll quote, is there should be no net loss in biodiversity at the route-wide level. And perhaps we could just dissect and have a look at that objective for a minute. Are you happy with the objective of there being no net loss in biodiversity terms? Is that ambitious enough?
Do you want me to start? I'm
yes.
Very happy to. The government has said that it wants to be the first government that actually sees an improvement in the environment. So it's not actually consistent with that. We would say that actually it's a no net loss is a laudable aim, but it could do better. The question, of course, is how you get there, who delivers it, and where the land is and who pays for the maintenance of it. Those are the much larger questions which will lead into your getting to no or even minor net loss.
So you think it could have been achievable with a little bit of ambition and foresight?
There's not much ambition in it, that's certainly true.
Yes, right.
I would add to that the ideal could be that it could have gone for net gain. A couple of issues we have with the environmental statement is that there's no adequate baseline. There's a lot of missing information, omissions and inaccuracies in their information. So it would be very difficult to assess that in the first place, to say what the baseline is.
I think we would say it's concerning the lack of integration between HS2 and wider policy. The National Planning Policy Framework talks about seeking environmental goals simultaneously and jointly with economic and social ones. The environmental statement seems to be about trying to minimise environmental harm rather than seek any environmental opportunities. I think there's a massive lost opportunity there that hopefully the government can correct in second reading.
What do you think are those opportunities they should be seeking and striving for?
Well, you've heard quite a lot about carbon in the previous session, and we certainly agree there that there is a need to seek carbon benefits from HS2. But much of those benefits would be secured by complementary changes to road and air policy. What we haven't heard much about is about land take. Now, in the news this week, there's been the Garden City at Ebbsfleet by HS1 and proposals for a new station on a greenfield site with associated housing at Crewe. We say that HS2 should be part of a bigger strategy to try to maximise use of brownfield land and reduce land take by car parking and roads. But unfortunately, it's not being planned in a joined-up fashion.
If you may, I'd also add that in terms of the no net loss suggestion, there's irreplaceable habitats such as ancient woodland that already, if they're being lost, you can't have a no net loss or net gain if you're taking out ancient woodland and other irreplaceable habitats such as that.
Thank you.
At the risk of wanting to come back, the real problem, and I don't want to be a stuck record on this throughout the proceedings, is that the problem is that if you're then taking the land for an environmental gain by compulsory purchase, there is a natural and severe injustice in that.
If we move on to the second part of the statement, which does actually say no net loss in biodiversity at the route-wide level, should we be judging the objective at a route-wide level, or should one be looking at smaller local sections of a line and making that assessment?
If you do it at a route-wide level, what you get is a series of large and largely arbitrary compulsory purchases where you're going to put your compensatory habitat. And that is the problem, therefore, with not engaging at a local level is you don't engage the local landowners to provide what they can provide better than anybody else for you for providing the environmental gains that you want.
I think there should be seek benefits net gain both at the route-wide level and at the local level. Now the question is, what do you use as a unit? Now the offsetting metric talks about biodiversity units. What exactly are they? Well, there is a detailed discussion in Appendix 5 of part of the ES But actually that's still very arbitrary. I think there needs to be, you need to look at the national scale and also maybe at the local landscape scale or the local habitat. You have to check all these different levels rather than think you can do it at one or the other.
In terms of the balance between the route-wide and the local, I would agree that there needs to be a bit of both. You need to be able to take into account the whole route-wide losses and gains to assess that, but also there's a natural justice in that if something's lost to a local community, they should have a benefit provided or a compensation provided at that stage as well. I'm not sure if there's further questions about biodiversity offsetting, but... okay, I'll leave that then.
And who, when it comes to actually monitoring and auditing that, whether there's been a no net loss, who should actually be doing that work? Any views?
Perhaps one of the situations, this is where some of the statutory agencies come in, such as Natural England, who you'll be hearing evidence from later. But again, one of the issues that we found is that in the drawing up of the environmental statement, there's been selective use of information from, for instance, from the local record centres that could have provided data. So, for instance, I know from Warwickshire County Council, they've had to do their own assessment because they found their data was better than HS2's, even though all the information went in to the environmental statement, it didn't come out. So that it could be a combination of Natural England working with local record centres and local wildlife groups.
I think it's very important we look at the recommendations of this month's second report of the Natural Capital Committee, and that's emphasised as one of its 4 principles, the importance of collaboration. Now, to agree with Richard, for collaboration you need to be sharing data, and one opportunity of HS2 is that it could be a sort of getting a huge amount of data of a cross-section across the countryside, but unfortunately we haven't always been able to get that data in a timely fashion. It's taken 2.5 months to get GIS data from the environmental statement, for example, which was too late for us to be able to use it in our response. I think one recommendation the committee could call for is much better timely release of data from HS2 so that there is, if not equality of arms, certainly a bit more fairness.
I would echo that, and I would think, I mean, farmers and landowners are perfectly used to having environmental concerns monitored, and it's been done by Natural England so far.
Thank you. And finally, just a question I think we did touch upon, do you think there is sufficient evidence or sufficient information to establish that baseline against which any monitoring will be done?
I'm afraid our analysis of the environmental statement doesn't show that. We found that over more than half of the woodlands haven't been surveyed, and our information provided through the Ecology Technical Group is that's as bad, if not worse, for other habitats. So for a start, the baseline information isn't there. There's lots of inaccuracies in terms of some of the woodland sizes. For instance, even in the same community forum area report, they'd be given different labels for woodlands and different sizes of woodlands that are going to be lost. So we have just found it's not up to scratch at the moment.
Why is that, do you think? Surely assessing on a map the size of a woodland is a fairly straightforward exercise, or not?
We're at a loss to explain that. I mean, that's one of the issues we've taken up. When we've gone through the environmental statement, we've found that there's more woodlands affected than indicated by HS2. That's directly affected. We found 27. We've also found 21 indirectly affected, and another 22 of woodlands that may be ancient, and we're getting that clarified by Natural England. I'm not sure why those inaccuracies are there.
I think one concern we have is that the lack of noise data about maximum noise. At the moment it's averaged out, and that isn't very realistic when you have a period of silence than a train rushing past, particularly in open areas of countryside where you can hopefully hear birdsong and little else. Having an averaged out sound isn't really very helpful to people to understand what the impact of HS2 would be and how much it should be reduced.
It's hard for me to explain why HS2's data isn't accurate, but I mean the baseline evidence is partly because they haven't approached and haven't been engaged with the landowner regularly enough or frequently enough or in enough detail from a very early stage.
Is this an issue, we're still at the stage now this can be rectified, do you think?
I would like to think so.
I think given we haven't unbought and the sector state is accepted, there will not be time to pass this bill until 2016. That gives us 2 years, so I'd say plenty of time for it to be rectified.
Because can I just ask on that, if my voice will allow me, how you think that can be rectified through the mechanism of the hybrid bill, in terms of the advice and expertise and resources that will be available to advise Parliament about those issues?
We learned yesterday, after a meeting with one of the transport ministers, that HS2 will actually be doing further survey work for some species during the next field season. I think
Which species?
Bats, and I think you'd have to ask HS2 that in a couple of weeks, unless they can say from the floor. I think we think they need to go further than that, including some of the woodlands and other habitats that haven't yet been surveyed. And in one of our recommendations is that the environmental statement should be modified to reflect any updated information and to correct the omissions and inaccuracies that we and other groups have highlighted. One of the ways to do that could be to produce an addendum that rectifies those issues and actually contains the missing information and the clarified information, if that's easier in terms of the bill process to achieve. But I'd agree with Rafe that there should be the time to do that if the projected parliamentary time is in 2 years.
And would you agree with the Wildlife Trust in Staffordshire that should extend to other than legally protected mammals? At the moment it seems that only legally protected mammals are part of the assessment that's been done.
Yes, we found that more than half of the habitats haven't been surveyed, so it should extend to more habitat surveys. And I agree with Henry that there needs to be more work with the landowners to gain access to the land and collaboration in order to get those surveys done.
I think my one concern is that given the size and difficulty of navigating the environmental statement as it is, if there are, and there surely will be, addendums, you'll have to have 2 separate volumes and try to pick between the two, and that will be difficult for specialists, let alone the public.
Okay. Mr. Barnes, the moment of talking about biodiversity offsetting is upon us.
3.
So, what I particularly wanted to find out a little more about is the in the environmental statement, the principles of the metric that they're setting out in the environmental statement are obviously somewhat different than what DEFRA have set out in its biodiversity and environment green paper. And what the environmental statement on HS2 appears to suggest is that, they actually state the metric has the potential to produce an iterative mechanism to review changes in the balance of ecological loss versus compensation associated with the proposed scheme, which appears to suggest that you learn as you go along and then you replace as you go along. Whereas the green paper talks about the question of complexity of habitats and linking of habitats and looking at the whole ecosystem network as you go. It's clearly therefore an adapted, one is an adapted version of the other, but do you think that the difference in approach is potentially better or potentially worse than the green paper approach?
Well, I think it's a little premature for HS2 to come out with modifying the biodiversity offsetting metrics before the government have had time to respond to either your committee's recommendations or the completion of the 6 pilot projects, which are due to end, I think, at the end of this month. I've heard today that DEFRA are now saying their response will be in the summer. That's because they've announced it at the Biodiversity Offsetting Conference by the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management today. So I've just learnt that this morning. But it seems to be getting further and further away. And for HS2 to come up with a metric in advance of all the detailed consultation, including yours, is a little premature. And of course, one of the issues the Woodland Trust has is that in the government metrics, ancient woodland is clearly outside biodiversity offsetting. You can't offset for the loss of an irreplaceable habitat. So the way HS2 is dealing with it is quite unique, yes.
Mm.